Niji ginana bolo re nita nore bharya evo haide tamare harakhana mayaji.
The ginans can be looked at from many different viewpoints. I think at a basic level, of course, people identify the ginans as the devotional literature of the Ismailis of South Asia. And of course, this tradition is not just confined to South Asia. As the Ismailis in South Asia moved to East Africa, to North America, to Europe, they took the tradition with them. But when we talk about them as devotional literature, we straight away think about their use in what I would call a liturgical or a ceremonial context. That is, that they are part of the worship service or the prayer service that takes place in the Jamaat Khana. So this is one venue, one location where people very often encounter the ginans in this, what I would say, a devotional context, a formalized devotional context. But the ginans themselves permeate the daily lives of South Asian Ismailis in many different ways. The title is a result of some interesting aspects of the Ginan tradition that I've noticed over the many years that I've been studying, and that is that the Ginans are recited regularly by different Ismaili communities in South Asia, and as such they are performed. And I always wondered, like, what's the importance of singing them and performing them in a certain way, performance in a broader sense. And people would feel very attached to the traditions because people felt that when they recited them, they felt peace or they felt happiness in listening to them. And then I noticed that there were a couple of verses in the Ginans that actually start talking about this connection between recitation and also happiness. So there's one Ginanic verse which is very often recited, which in English translates as, recite the Ginans and your hearts will be filled with happiness. So there was that first connection, I think, with happiness, with ecstasy. And then I found that actually what brings about this happiness? And there I found another verse of a Ginan, which actually is on the jacket of the book. And this is a Ginan that's attributed to Pir Shams. And the verse itself is an interesting verse because it says, remember the name of your Lord, and you will get enlightenment and you will get happiness. So I think that combination of recitation and happiness, but also enlightenment and happiness, led really to this idea of ecstasy. And ecstasy I used because very often this happiness is described as something that is overwhelming. So hence ecstasy and enlightenment. When you study the Ginans within the context of the literary traditions of South Asia, you notice that they have certain features, both in terms of their structure, their symbolisms, the metaphors that they use, that are shared actually with other traditions in South Asia. On the one hand, there are features that are shared with what I would call the Indic traditions, especially bhakti, the Bhakti tradition, which is a tradition of devotional poetry that today we identify with the Hindu tradition, but it also has some very close connections with the traditions of poetry that developed amongst various Sufi groups in South Asia. Sufism is a very powerful force in South Asia, and many Muslims in South Asia have actually experienced Islam through, I would say, the Sufi tradition, particularly Sufi literature that is in the vernacular, but very often performed, just like the ginans are performed. And so I think that when we look at the ginans, you see immediately these resonances with these traditions. And that is why in the book itself, I try to contextualize the study of the ginans and how we think about the ginans. One of the issues that comes up when you study a tradition like the ginans that emerged and developed in pre-modern India, and by pre-modern I mean before colonialism, before the rise of nationalism, the nation states, before India and Pakistan, is that in the modern context, there have been certain notions that have developed about religion. For example, the notion that there is a Hinduism, and or this notion that religions are ideologies of political identity. These notions are so prevalent today in India, and I would say, of course, in Pakistan. In fact, the very notion of India and Pakistan is premised on this notion that very often when people start looking at traditions like the ginans, they tend to project this onto the past. And I think that that is not a academically sound way of trying to study a tradition. We need to be able to study a tradition in its own terms. And there are some people who have labeled the ginans as Hindu just because their modern conceptions of what is Hindu are tied with the vernacular things that belong to the Indian cultural milieu and so on. That is Hindu, as opposed to something that belongs to Arabic and Persian is Islamic. So what I'm trying to do in the book is actually say, no, we should be rethinking how we study the ginans by trying to be faithful to their context and avoid this labeling. So instead of using the label Hindu or Hinduism, which I feel again is a modern conception, I'm using the term Indic to suggest that what you see in the ginans are a tradition that is that resonates with the general sort of trends in Indic civilization and Indic culture, and it's not so much about religion, but about some cultural resonances, for example, metaphors, symbols, and so on, that many other religious groups, for instance, will use. On the one hand, there are linguistic challenges that arise from the fact that the ginans, first of all, are written in many different dialects, in fact, many different languages as well. So you can read a text of the Ginan, and you will come across vocabulary items that will not appear in any dictionary. And so you have to try to then look at, broader sort of philological derivations of this term to try to figure out where does this term come from and what is its meaning. Another challenge is the fact that the language of many of these ginans is pre-modern, so that modern grammar and modern structures are now not very helpful in trying to understand, pre-modern literature. So that sometimes is also a challenge in trying to understand the meaning. So I think one is the vocabulary itself. The other is the grammar, the structure. A third issue, and this comes up a lot in the manuscripts, the script in which the ginans are written, the Khojki script, was a script that was not standardized until the early 20th century. And there were different versions of this script. As a result, when you're reading the manuscripts from different parts of India, you see their variance in the characters, in the alphabet itself. So sometimes when you're reading the manuscripts, you have to figure out, okay, this letter, what sound is it representing? Because it may not appear in other manuscripts. So it may be a letter that is specific to a particular region or a particular locality. And that adds to the linguistic complications. So this is just to give you a sense of it can be quite challenging, but it's also quite exciting because it involves, as I like to see, detective work. You know, you have to try to figure out, it's a mystery, and then you try to solve the mystery. And when you do solve it, you get a great sense of satisfaction. I've been fascinated with thinking about that as the community goes from a pre-colonial to a colonial to a post-colonial context, say from the 17th, 18th century into the 19th century, into the 20th century, into the 21st century, the community has been evolving and changing, and its notions of identity have been changing. So what I've been fascinated is to see how the ways in which people look at the ginans and interpret the ginans has also been changing and evolving. It's not that the ginans have been marginalized, but the frameworks in which people are thinking about the ginans has changed. So let me give you an example. I would say in the pre-modern period, so we are talking about 17th century or so, the ginans were a local tradition. Very often people in a particular community, in a particular village or in a particular locality were familiar with the tradition. They had very little contact with other communities who were using the ginans, because this was the day when, you know, we didn't have print culture, we didn't have books. The traditions were transmitted orally, and we did have some manuscripts, but for people who were illiterate, the main form of connecting with the tradition was through memory and memorization, and also the singing. Now, if you sort of fast forward into the 21st century, you see first the tradition has become, I would say, cosmopolitan, global, in the sense that the Ismaili, the identity of South Asian Ismailis, who we call the Khojas, has changed. They realize that they are connected to Ismailis in Iran, in Tajikistan, in Central Asia, in Syria, and so on, in other parts of the world. And these other communities also have their traditions of devotion. So the ways in which they are now looking at the ginans has changed. But what's also changed is that the way in which the Ismailis of South Asia and the South Asian diaspora are looking at the ginans. They rely very much on print culture. They're the books, but they're also relying on other forms of media. Initially it started out with cassette tapes, now CDs, and then following that now they're MP3s, and also if you go on the internet, you find a very robust presence of Ginanic sort of texts on the internet as well. So you see that the tradition itself and the way it's being transmitted and the way in which people are interacting with it has been totally transformed. I've been studying different aspects of the Ginan tradition for many years. And what you see in Ecstasy and Enlightenment is really a collection of different types of studies that I've done. There are some studies that are, I would say, more from the perspective of the history of religions, where I'm looking at the ginans as devotional literature, how they function as a religious text within the community in a performative context. Other parts of the book look at analyze some of the symbolism and metaphors, look at them as from a literary context. And then there are other chapters in the book that go into the manuscript traditions of the ginans. So that's another dimension that I have in this book. So the book itself covers scholarship in very different areas. So therefore, I think it would appeal to specialists in many different fields, in literature, in history of religions, in people who are interested in philology, paleography, the study of manuscripts, and so on. So the book itself is a representative, or it represents different things that I've done with the ginans. But I have to say that what I've done here is just really barely scratching the surface. Well, I think that there are several areas that need a lot of work. One area is that of preparing critical editions of texts. There have been very few ginanic texts that have actually been studied in a detailed linguistic or a philological manner, in the sense that people taking a text of a particular ginan and then seeing how it has been recorded in different manuscript traditions and doing a comparative study of how words can change over time, or how sometimes even the recitation styles can change over time, because sometimes the Ginan manuscripts indicate the ragas, the melodies which texts are to be recited. So sometimes you find a difference between that. So that's one area. I think preparing like critical editions of texts. As far as I know, there were only 2 or 3 ginans for which that has happened. So most of the corpus remains, understudied. I think another area of great importance is the cataloging the manuscripts themselves, because this is a huge initiative. So far, the only catalog that we have right now that is published is that of the Harvard collection, but which is a small collection. But that's the only thing we have. So the Institute of Ismaili Studies collection is now being cataloged, but that, I think, is a major undertaking. And once that is completed, I think that will be a huge contribution to the field. But as I said, it's a massive task and will take several years. I think a third area, as I've mentioned before, is this issue of Ginan performance, because the Ginans are an oral text. They're recited, they're sung, they're performed, and studying how these performative traditions have developed over time, how these performative traditions are actually changing as the generations are changing. That's another dimension that needs to be looked at. I would also say a fourth dimension is also looking at how individuals themselves who are connected with the Ginanic tradition have been reinterpreting these traditions, both in the performance, but I think also in the way they interpret the text itself, doing a kind of ethnographic study of how individuals themselves are relating to the tradition in changed context is another dimension. The Ginans today play many different roles. On the one hand, they're obviously a source of identity for Ismailis who are of South Asian origin or who come from the diaspora from South Asia. It gives them a sense of rooting with their past, with their ancestral culture. And in a situation where people's identities are being challenged by globalization, by westernization, people need to feel they have an anchor, that they have roots. So I think the ginans play a very important role that way. I think they also play a very important role in terms of providing inspiration for people, particularly the ginans that have messages of spirituality, mysticism embedded in them, which talk about the nature of life, the transitory nature of the material world, the idea that the material world is a world that that one cannot always rely on, in the sense that there is a spiritual world, there's a world that is eternal, but in a certain way which is constant, and in which the soul is part of. Those notions are so strong in the ginans that I think many people today still attach a great deal of significance to the ginans because they see them as a source of spirituality in a time when we are becoming increasingly materialistic.